This lecture tells the story of modern Russia from 1941 to the present. In many ways, Russia came into the modern world in the 20th century, very dramatically and with enormous suffering, particularly through two world wars and indeed other global conflicts, and as usual, tremendous suffering as characteristic of Russian history. These are pivotal years as well for the development of Russia, where it continued to expand under the auspices of the Soviet Union, and then eventually the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and we see a return to the country of Russia with the Russian Federation since that year. Modern Russia and our understanding of Russia in the 20th century really has so much to do with the Second World War, or as the Russians call it, the Great Patriotic War. It is hard to overstate the amount of suffering and destruction that Russia and the states that constituted the Soviet Union suffered during the course of World War II. Indeed, Russia would suffer more than any other country during World War II from casualties. We've already examined the Russian Revolution and the Civil War and the famine, which took millions of lives in Russia. World War I, for Russia itself, probably took somewhere around 5 million lives. The Holodomor constituted another 10 million lives lost due to the terror famine. Those 10 million lives are part of the larger 20 million lives that were lost during the reign of Joseph Stalin. And then World War II, to cap it all off, will see the death of somewhere around 25 to 27 million lives, civilians and military personnel, over the course of the Second World War. It is the greatest event in modern Russian history. That's why they call it the Great Patriotic War, in which they see a tremendous, massive German invasion and then successfully rout that invasion and securing their power and influence over European and world affairs for the remainder of the 20th century. Indeed, in many ways, the Second World War certainly wasn't expected, and in many ways was endeavored to be prevented with Russia. Indeed, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union contracted an agreement of peace, non-aggression. The Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 saw the German foreign minister, von Ribbentrop, visit Joseph Stalin and sign an agreement that they would not invade each other, that they would not go to war against each other. That was the public part of the treaty. The private part of the treaty was that there would be an understanding that once Germany invaded Poland, Russia too would move against Poland from the east and take a share of Poland as well. Thus, for the second time in history, we see a partitioning of Poland with complicity of the German states as well as Russia to the east. And so Hitler is able to focus his aggressive campaigns towards Western Europe, Scandinavia, and the Low Countries, and France, and also move against the Balkans, because he knows his eastern border is secure with the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. And indeed, Joseph Stalin, who is so distrustful of his own people, always suspicious, always plotting against, always concerned about plots against him, believed that Adolf Hitler would not lie to him. And indeed, because of this pact, makes no military preparations against a possible reversal of policy and a Nazi invasion from the West. Indeed, even as Nazi armies are mounting and massing on the Soviet Union's western border, Stalin still refuses to believe reports to anticipate a Nazi invasion. He just refuses that Hitler would break his word after signing the Non-Aggression Pact. Thus, the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin are completely taken by surprise in the spring of 1941 when Nazi Germany launches Operation Barbarossa, a massive three-pronged attack against the Soviet Union by the Germans from the West. Indeed, Adolf Hitler had utter contempt for the Russians and for all Slavic peoples. He believed that they were racially inferior, that they were barbaric, that they were inferior in civilization and faith and development. And Hitler often remarked that it'd be quite easy to move against the Bolsheviks in the East. And indeed, Russia was a rotting, collapsing shack. And all that needed to happen was you needed to kick in the door and the whole thing would collapse. And so, despite not securing victory in the West, he still had not defeated Great Britain in his military campaigns in the West. Hitler loses focus and turns it towards the East and is determined to destroy the Soviet Union, even though, by the terms of the Non-Aggression Pact, Germany was still at peace with the Soviet Union. Hitler acts against the advice of his generals and general staff, and orders this invasion, and therefore the general staff of Nazi Germany is forced to design an attack plan. The attack plan takes place with three large army groups moving in a three-pronged attack from Russia, from Germany, across Poland, and then into the Soviet Union. One pronged attack would move towards Leningrad, which was the former city of St. Petersburg, the former historic capital of Russia. A middle army group would move against key cities in central Belarus and the Ukraine into Russia, including Minsk and Smolensk, and finally capture the capital of Moscow. And the third army group would move towards the south, particularly towards the Crimea, and knock out the city of Stalingrad along the way. Indeed, Hitler's predictions about the frailty of the Soviet state and the Soviet army seemed to come true initially. And indeed, with great force and great speed, the Germans are able to quickly march east into the Soviet Union, knocking out any bits of army resistance against them. Indeed, there are large sections of the population of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, that go over to the Germans, that never wanted to be under Soviet domination, and indeed were willing to take their chances under the rulership of Adolf Hitler compared to the terror that they had experienced under Joseph Stalin. So any type of resistance against the German invasion quickly collapses as the Germans move into the Baltic states and into western portions of the Soviet Union. Immediately they go into villages. Many partisans who are willing to abandon Soviet rule and support the Germans come over to their side. And the Germans demand to know where is the local Jewish and gypsy population. And indeed, the locals often surrender those Jewish populations, and the German Einsatzgruppen, or mobile killing squads, go into these villages and then round up the Jews and bring them out into surrounding forests and either gas them or shoot them and then bury them in mass graves. And therefore, the German army makes incredible progress, quickly moving east. The Soviet army is completely disorganized. There really is no experienced or capable command staff to the Soviet army. You remember that so many military officers, high-ranking generals, and field marshals had been purged by Joseph Stalin. They had been removed from their position. Therefore, the Soviet army is completely dilapidated, weak, poorly commanded, disorganized, poorly supplied, and the well-trained, well-honed, well-experienced, well-commanded, best army in the world, the Nazi army, quickly brushes them aside, quickly moves into the western parts of the Soviet Union, continuing to march east, demonstrating their famous blitzkrieg or lightning war, often with the use of tanks, half-tracks, and also Stuka dive bombers, descending on Soviet cities, terrorizing the Soviet population, and quickly destroying key outposts in cities, and moving against the main cities of Leningrad to the north, Moscow in the center, and then also Stalingrad to the south. And indeed, there are large portions of the population of the Soviet army that surrender to the German army. There's massive amounts of military material that is surrendered to the Germans, many guns. Many Soviet POWs are sent to German POW camps. Many of these Soviet soldiers are never seen again. Indeed, they are executed in German prison camps. Many of them are quite initially willing to go over to the German side, believing that they'll have a better life under German occupation. And so very easily, the German army continues to march east and particularly north against the city of Leningrad. Remember that St. Petersburg is the historic capital of Russia, but because the Bolsheviks had more support in Moscow, they moved the capital of the Soviet Union to Moscow and renamed St. Petersburg after the leader of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin. And so St. Petersburg becomes known as Leningrad. At Leningrad, you can see this picture taken by the German army of St. Isaac's Cathedral in the distance. The Nazis are able to just about surround the city and lay siege to the city. There in the city, tremendous suffering and deprivation will take place over the course of this 2-year, 4-month, 2-week, and 5-day siege of the city. You can see that the city of Leningrad was completely surrounded by Nazi armies, and instead of directly taking the city, often the Nazis would shell the city and surround it, and therefore prevent hardly any supplies coming into the city. And very quickly, famine and a bitterly cold winter sets into the city. There's very little in the way of coal or wood for fuel to heat homes during the winter, and a tremendous famine breaks out across the city with hundreds of thousands of people dying due to the lack of food. All the horses are eaten, and then dogs and cats, and there are reports as well of cannibalism, of people being so hungry that they begin to eat the dead bodies of their friends and relatives over the course of the famine. Another army group will continue to move against the center, and particularly the capital. You remember that Napoleon Bonaparte was successful in taking the city of Moscow during his Russian invasion in 1812. The Nazis too will move against Moscow. The Nazis will get within 15 miles of the city. And indeed, finally, weeks after the invasion has taken place, finally Joseph Stalin comes out of this stupor, out of this disbelief that his friend Adolf Hitler would betray him, and finally takes action, takes control of the government, and organizes the defense of key cities, including Moscow. You can see barricades here, and then also anti-tank ditches built, dug outside of the city of Moscow. The Nazis will lay siege to Leningrad, but the city will never fall into Nazi hands. The Nazis will also move against the city of Moscow. They will come within 15 miles of the city, but never be able to take the city. So Napoleon is able to take it in 1812, but the Nazis never do take Moscow in their invasion during World War II. Really, so much of the pivotal fighting of Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of Russia, takes place to the south at the city of Stalingrad. Stalingrad, a city obviously named for the General Secretary and leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin. This is where the turning point of the invasion really takes place. It is one of the largest and most pivotal battles, perhaps the most pivotal battle of the entire Second World War, with a large German invasion headed towards the south, going towards key oil fields, particularly in the Caucasus, and then all the way down into Persia, and moving in that direction with the city of Stalingrad along the way. In many ways, the Nazis seal their fate in their campaign against Stalingrad very early in the campaign by sending in their Stuka dive bombers and leveling the city of Stalingrad. They subject Stalingrad to numerous days and nights of bombing, which really levels the city and just turns the city into rubble. That rubble, of course, becomes one machine gun nest, one sniper nest, one foxhole, one bunker after another. So now the city becomes even more difficult to take, with the Germans are going to have to fight corner by corner, street by street, building by building, block by block in order to take the city of Stalingrad. And of course, the Russians know the city better than the Germans do. The sewers are often made use of for transporting supplies and men, and every bombed out building becomes another bunker that becomes difficult for the German army to get bogged down in. Indeed, that is what happens. The invasion of the Soviet Union and the reach all the way to Stalingrad represents the height of Nazi influence and Nazi domination in Europe. And after months and months of fighting in Stalingrad, and then another brutal winter in this portion of Russia, the casualties mount tremendously on both sides. The fearsome fighting in Stalingrad would lead to approximately 2 million casualties combined, a little less than 1 million for the Germans and a little over 1 million for the Soviets. Indeed, many of the Soviet troops who were continuing to retreat in the face of the German advance in the early weeks of the invasion, finally an order comes down from the General Secretary himself, Joseph Stalin, and orders his officers to shoot any man who takes one step back and begins to retreat. So for the common Soviet soldier, his choices were either retreat and be shot by your own officer, your own commander, or to advance against often withering German machine guns and German fire. As a result, the casualties are just immense in Stalingrad. Tremendous losses on both sides, often with heaps and heaps of dead soldiers along the river and then scattered throughout the city. There are two interesting tales that go along with the Battle of Stalingrad, including the story of one famous sniper, Vasily Zaitsev, who becomes a hero of the Soviet Union. Because Stalingrad is so destroyed by rubble, it really becomes a sniper's haven, and the Germans bring in some of their best snipers to knock out key Soviet positions. But Vasily Zaitsev becomes a hero among the Soviet Union and encourages strong Soviet resistance in Stalingrad. Zaitsev is given credit for killing 225 enemy soldiers, including 11 German snipers. So he's a key part in turning the tide of the battle at Stalingrad. Also important were female pilots that the Germans came to call night witches. The night witches didn't receive extensive training, but nevertheless they become heroes of the Soviet Union for their ability to strafe German positions and indeed play a key part in turning the tide of the battle, and the Germans came to fear their assaults against their positions. Slowly, gradually, because of the enormous losses the Germans are facing far away from home, the Soviets are able to finally take one block and one city after another in Stalingrad and gradually push the Germans out of the city, securing victory in the city of Stalingrad in 1943, although the city is almost completely destroyed. Indeed, very little remains of the rubble from the battle, only a few scattered buildings. Many of them have obviously been repaired. The city today is the city of Volgograd, still in the southern part of Russia, but nevertheless a monument to a key victory in World War II in beating back the Nazi menace. Shortly after the Battle of Stalingrad, the Germans counterattack in the Battle of Kursk. And at Kursk, we have the largest tank battle in history, pivotal battle on the southern steppes of Russia. And indeed, the Russians, because of their use of the T-34 tank, the very best tank in World War II, they are able to turn the tide of the battle at the Battle of Kursk. The Soviets are also aided by a very feared weapon nicknamed Stalin's Organ, or the Katyusha launchers, which were early rocket launchers, which because of the screech and scream that the rockets made as they came at your position became very feared among the Germans. And thus, because the Nazi army is so overextended and because of the fortitude of the Soviet army And because of supplies from the United States, particularly jeeps and trucks and uniforms, as well as felt-lined boots that the common Soviet soldier were able to use that were produced in the United States, the Soviets are able to turn the tide of the battle. And once again, for the third time in Russian history, the Swedish invasion under Charles XII of Russia in the early 1700s, Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812, and now Hitler's invasion of Russia beginning in 1941, the Soviets are able to beat back the invaders and push them back to the west, and the long campaign of retreat for the Germans continues through bitterly cold conditions, high snowfall, temperatures that drop 10, 20, and 30 degrees below zero, freezing half-tracks and jeeps, tanks, all types of vehicles, rendering rifles and machine guns useless, and the steppes of Russia are just littered with the German dead as the Soviets continue to push them out of Russia and then advance on their own native Germany. Many German soldiers freezing in the snow, dying from frostbite, losing limbs, as the Soviets, with a national effort, are really able to rally together and then continue to push west, and then finally meet up with the Americans who are coming from the east after the Normandy landings. And together at Torgau, famous photograph, April 25th, 1945, Torgau, Germany, as the Soviets from the east meet the Americans coming from the west and shake hands, squeezing Nazi Germany in the middle, and they're, of course, securing the defeat of Nazi Germany. It is given by the Allied command to the Soviet army to take the capital of Nazi Germany, of Berlin, and therefore a large-scale campaign begins against the Nazi capital of Berlin from April to May. It was controversial for the Americans not to engage in this battle and take the city, but it's fortunate for the Americans as the Battle of Berlin for the Soviet army would result in another 100,000 casualties just in the vicious street-to-street fighting taking place as the Nazis vigorously defended their capital and are witnessing the end of the Third Reich and their collapse of their city. Thereafter, the Soviets are able to move into key positions and take famous sites, including the Brandenburg Gate, and another famous photograph of a Soviet soldier climbing all the way to the top of the Reichstag, the German parliament, and flying the Soviet flag over the Nazi capital. The darker side of the conquest of Berlin for the Soviet army is the recurrence of mass rape against German women by Soviet soldiers. Indeed, historians estimate that somewhere around 100,000 women were raped by Soviet soldiers as they moved into Berlin, and indeed over the entirety of Eastern Germany, approximately 1.5 million German women were raped by Soviet soldiers as an act of humiliation and further conquest, symbol of conquest by the Soviet army. And indeed, after the Battle of Berlin, the capital city of the Nazis is completely destroyed, a city of entirely of rubble. That, of course, will become a flashpoint for the approaching Cold War. It is also in Berlin, in his bunker in the Chancellery Gardens, that Adolf Hitler marries his mistress and then commits suicide later the same night. And therefore, the Soviet army blows up the bunker. That site today is an apartment complex in Berlin. And so there's great jubilation, great celebration, of course, for the Soviets in their victory over Adolf Hitler and defeating Nazi Germany. The great tragedy, of course, after World War II is that the Allies squabble, and therefore it leads to another conflict that we designate the Cold War. The Cold War, of course, is different than a hot war. A hot war is a shooting war. Cold War is a war of tension and a war of words and competing ideologies that will really define world history from 1945 the end of World War II, until 1991. Indeed, the Soviet Union was an ally of the United States and Great Britain during the course of World War II. These three great nations had teamed up together and provided resources to each other in order to secure the defeat of Imperial Japan, but particularly Nazi Germany. And indeed, the Allies were on good terms when the three heads of state met at Yalta, which is in the Crimea, in February of 1945. At the Yalta Conference, United States President Franklin Roosevelt, United Kingdom Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and General Secretary of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, demanded the unconditional surrender of Germany, which they are able to secure by the end of the war. They declared that Germany was to be denazified, that there would be free elections for Poland. Even though the Soviet troops had occupied Poland and much of Eastern Europe, the Soviets promised that there would be free elections and that they would not interfere with those elections. The USSR promised to join the United Nations and also help the United States defeat Japan, and also that trials for war criminals would be set up and that Germany would be divided. So a few months later, that summer in 1945, three heads of state met again. This time, however, with the death of President Franklin Roosevelt, it was U.S. President Harry Truman, that the three heads of state now came together on German-conquered soil at Potsdam. At Potsdam, the three heads of state come together, and eventually Winston Churchill is replaced in an election with Prime Minister Clement Attlee. So Attlee, Truman, and Stalin decided at the Potsdam Conference that Germany would be divided into four occupational zones. Berlin, the city itself, would be divided into four occupation zones. Additional details on the trials for war criminals. All German-occupied territory was to be evacuated by foreign troops. 10% of the industry in Soviet-occupied Germany was to be sent to the USSR, and other qualifications for post-war Germany. So how did these allies that worked together for the defeat of Nazi Germany eventually lapse into squabbling and then eventually division that led to the Cold War, which had the threat of leading to a third world war? Indeed, there are many causes of the Cold War, including American suspicion and fear of communist subversion. Of course, the Soviet Union had established the Comintern, which was designed to spread worldwide communist revolution. The Americans were afraid of that occurring in Western Europe and also in the United States. There was a growing mistrust between the United States and the Soviet Union over the course of these wartime conferences. The Soviet Union was very fearful of the American monopoly that the United States had regarding nuclear weapons and the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And really what we see with the development of the Cold War are two very different political and economic systems, two opposing political and economic systems. Whereas the United States emphasized its democratic, popular government, self-government traditions, the Soviet Union was dominated by a totalitarian dictatorship, that of Joseph Stalin and the Communist Party. There's also difference in the economic systems, as the United States ostensibly was a capitalist free market economy, and the Soviet Union was a communist system. Further angering both sides was the disputes over Eastern Europe after the war. Indeed, as Soviet troops pushed the Nazis out of Western Russia and move into Eastern Europe, the Soviet troops don't leave. And despite earlier promises of securing free elections in Eastern Europe, those free elections never take place. And indeed, the Soviets are instrumental in making sure that communist governments that are loyal to Joseph Stalin and loyal to the Soviet Union, protecting Soviet interests, are elected in Eastern Europe, in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and then, of course, Eastern Germany as well. The Soviets continued to move against West Berlin. There was a mutual fear of attack on both sides. For much of the Cold War, there's a great fear that the other country would attack and one would find themselves defenseless. And much dispute that led to the Cold War really had to do with Eastern Europe, particularly with the Soviets now From the Russian perspective, they had been invaded twice just in the first half of the 20th century from the West. And therefore, the Soviets were determined to create a buffer zone to occupy Eastern European countries that would provide a buffer state or buffer zone against further invasion from the West. Of course, the American and British perspective was that the Soviets were dominating free states of Eastern Europe and imposing communist totalitarian systems upon them. And then, of course, another source of antagonism was the Soviet avowed mission to spread worldwide communism, particularly in the Western European states in the United States. As a result, what we see is a retreat into two different camps, two different defensive alliances over the course of the Cold War. The Western European states, particularly led by France and Great Britain and West Germany, Italy, Spain, and the United States and Canada, formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO. This was a defensive alliance in which, if one country was attacked, if one member state was attacked, then it was to be considered an attack by all member states, and therefore all member states would all go to war in defense of that one country. Fearing the influence of NATO, the Eastern European states, under the leadership of the Soviet Union, come together and form the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact served the same purpose, that if a Western state attacked one of the communist states of the East, then it was considered an attack on all. So in the Soviet Union, after World War II, there is an enormous victory parade in Red Square once again. Once again, the Soviet High Command and Joseph Stalin assemble on the balcony of Lenin's tomb in Red Square, and tens of thousands of Soviet troops who have been instrumental in the victory march throughout Red Square, often parading the fruits of their victory. There are numerous monuments throughout Russia still today commemorating Russia's great victory in World War II in driving out the Nazi invasion. This is the Great Patriotic War Memorial in Moscow, one of the largest memorials to the Soviet victory in World War II. And then in the course of this victory parade, all the Nazi flags and emblems of Adolf Hitler, all the signage that the Nazis had put up advocating its ideology are captured, brought to Red Square, and thrown in the square as a symbol of victory. In the city of Berlin, the Soviet army continues to occupy the city, and of course Berlin will become an important flashpoint for the Cold War. As indeed all of Eastern Europe will, this buffer zone that Stalin demanded to control states like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria as a buffer against further invasion from the West. And indeed, many sections of Germany, particularly in Eastern Europe, there are large factories that are literally dismantled, loaded onto railroad flat cars, and then shipped east to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is instrumental really in plundering so much of Germany and Eastern Europe of its industrial capacity, sending it east to the Soviet Union to augment its own industrial production. Whereas the United States held a monopoly over atomic weaponry at the end of World War II, it didn't take long, really through the instrumentality of Soviet spies in the American nuclear project, that the Soviet Union is able to explode its first atomic weapon in 1949. This is a very dramatic event and a very dangerous event, because what it signaled was that this new conflict between the United States and its Western allies and the Soviet Union was not simply a conflict that could result in conventional warfare of tanks and planes and jeeps and guns, but now it could become a nuclear worldwide holocaust, with both sides quickly arming themselves to the teeth with numerous nuclear bombs and then eventually nuclear missiles as well. It really signals just how dangerous the world got after the conclusion of the Second World War. Joseph Stalin's health gradually declined in the early 1950s, And indeed, he refused to let many doctors treat him or examine him. He was enormously suspicious of all those around him, that they were secretly plotting against him. And indeed, he was particularly suspicious that all his doctors were Jewish and were secretly poisoning him. He would often sleep in multiple places over the course of one night to guard against assassination. But nevertheless, he dies on March 5th, 1953, the end of a long, brutal, horrific era in Russian history. Although he becomes so admired, there's such a cult of personality surrounding Stalin that even in some quarters of Russia today, it still continues. The real legacy of Stalin, of course, is totalitarianism, strengthening of the Soviet Union, winning World War II, but also enormous oppression, horrific violence against his own people. He is probably responsible for the deaths of somewhere around 20 million Russians, and that does not include the casualties, the additional 25 million that were killed in World War II because of the Nazi invasion. So much of the legacy of Joseph Stalin has to do with the creation of a police state, that people became very fearful of the government, particularly through the instrumentality of the KGB. The KGB was a secret state police that had morphed out of the Cheka that the Bolsheviks had created. So once again, there's a long history of secret state police organizations that served the Tsar or communist leaders in Russian history. We've talked about Ivan the Terrible's Oprichniki. We talked about the Tsar's Okhrana. And we talked about the Cheka formed by the Bolsheviks. And now the Cheka becomes the KGB. This is the headquarters of the KGB in Moscow. And indeed, in the basement of this building, hundreds and thousands of individuals were often arrested, brought to the basement of this building, and given a mock trial, and often executed in its chambers below, or imprisoned, or sent off to work camps and never seen again. With the death of Stalin, we see the emergence of three leaders, sometimes called a troika. This troika was three individuals that tried to govern the Soviet Union, all competing for power after the death of Stalin. Grigory Melenkov, Lavrenti Beria, Vyacheslav Molotov all came together made their claim for power. However, it's none of them that actually are able to secure leadership of the Soviet Union after Stalin's death, but rather it's Nikita Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev takes as well the title of Secretary of the Communist Party. Remember that this was the historic title that Stalin held, and Stalin elevated this title as the leader of the Soviet Union. And so Khrushchev himself also takes this title, First Secretary of the Communist Party, who will be the definitive leader of the Soviet Union from 1953 until he is forced from power in 1964. Khrushchev had made a name for himself during the Great Patriotic War, during the Second World War, as he was instrumental in organizing resistance against the German invasion, particularly at Stalingrad. He becomes one of the heroes in the Soviet military at Stalingrad, ordering the execution of any Soviet soldier who would retreat and not advance against the German armies. Khrushchev really shocks the world in 1956 when he delivers the so-called secret speech. The irony of the secret speech was that it wasn't incredibly secret. Indeed, it was delivered privately, closed-door session of the Politburo and the key leaders of the Soviet Union. But very quickly, the text of the speech makes it out to Western newspapers and audiences. And in the secret speech, Khrushchev does something that no one had dared to do for several decades, which was criticize Stalin and criticize the direction that the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, had taken place. Indeed, the secret speech begins a process that we see occurring somewhat in the Soviet Union and also in other Eastern European states of de-Stalinization. In many ways, the debate between Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin that they had during their lifetimes, in some ways, Trotsky wins the argument after both Stalin and Trotsky are dead, in the sense that Trotsky said Stalin had made the revolution about himself, not about worldwide communist revolution and the principles and the ideology of communism, but he had made it about himself and had developed Stalinism. Therefore, what Khrushchev called for was a reduction or an end to Stalinization, sometimes called de-Stalinization, in which there would be some loosening of the terror that the secret police had inflicted on the people, certainly an improvement in the conditions of the people, particularly not using food as a weapon and provoking famine as well. We also see a measure of de-Stalinization in the renaming of Stalingrad as the city is rebuilt after World War II back to its historic name of Volgograd. And so even within the Soviet Union, there is this belief that Stalin had gone too far. One of the major accomplishments of the Soviet Union, indeed, at the forefront of technology in the world in the late 1950s, was the space race, and particularly the launching of Sputnik. Sputnik is a Russian word for little traveler. This was the first satellite ever launched into orbit the Earth. And it provoked enormous fear and consternation, particularly in the United States, because the Soviets were the first to put a satellite in space. Now, albeit it was essentially a large beach ball with some antennas and simply sent back a steady beeping sound back to Earth. Nevertheless, for many Americans and Western Europeans, they believed that the Soviets were so far ahead in the space race that indeed, very soon, the Soviets would be putting atomic weapons on their satellites and be able to hit the United States and Western Europe, and the Western allies and the NATO alliance would be able to do nothing about it. So there's great fear in the United States after the launching of Sputnik. Indeed, it led to the creation of NASA in the United States. There's even more fear in the United States in the early 1960s when Russia, which continues to prove itself far ahead in its space program than the Western allies, puts the first man into orbit. Yuri Gagarin, the first cosmonaut, the Russian astronaut, is the first to orbit the Earth and then return to the Earth safely, and of course becomes a hero in the Soviet Union. In many ways, there is an emerging debate throughout the 1950s and 1960s about which socioeconomic system is better, the totalitarian communism of the Soviet Union or the democratic capitalism of the United States. These two ideologies, indeed, are debated in a rather humorous scene in the so-called kitchen debate. At the kitchen debate in 1959, Vice President of the United States Richard Nixon confronted in an impromptu debate with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev over the merits of American television and American washing machines and consumer goods, whereas Khrushchev highlighted and celebrated Soviet space accomplishments. And the debate continued between two nations. Nikita Khrushchev made a famous visit to the United States in 1959. Indeed, he was the first Soviet leader to ever come to the United States as the guest of President Eisenhower in 1959. He was treated with a state dinner. So even as these two nations are launched into a very Cold War with nuclear missiles aimed at each other, there are efforts at diplomacy to get the two sides to negotiate and speak with each other. Nikita Khrushchev made a famous visit to Iowa, where he visited large agricultural fields and particularly becomes fascinated with corn production in Iowa. One of the huge embarrassments for the Soviet Union in the 1950s, despite trumpeting its system, its communist system, as providing equality for all and far more equitable than the capitalism of the West, one of the huge embarrassments for the Soviet Union was that still large segments of the population are starving. And indeed, the Soviet Union has to import food from other countries, particularly its enemy, the United States, in order to feed its own population. So this is, of course, a propaganda embarrassment for the Soviet Union that they can't feed their own people and have to import food from the United States. And so after Khrushchev's visit to the United States in 1959, he returns to Russia and launched what he calls the Virgin Lands campaign, in which large areas, particularly the southern part of Russia, the Russian steppe, which was perfect for agricultural development, is converted to the growing of corn. Indeed, corn becomes an obsession of Nikita Khrushchev. He often could not deliver a single speech without somehow speaking about corn. And indeed, often he would promise to not talk about corn in his speech and then proceed to talk about corn and the value. But nevertheless, the Soviet Union still is unable, due to its poor agricultural procedures, is unable to feed itself and continues to have to import food from around the United States to the Soviet Union. One of the early flashpoints in the Cold War, a moment of crisis that could have led to a nuclear exchange, and indeed the Third World War, which would have been a nuclear war, was the U-2 crisis. In that year, in 1960, the United States had developed the SR-71, which was a high-altitude spy plane. It was one of the highest altitude planes in the world and had very advanced surveillance technology. This was a type of technology that the Soviet Union or any other country was not really able to compete with. And therefore, President Eisenhower authorized the CIA to launch these U-2 flights, these planes, high-altitude surveillance planes, to fly over the Soviet Union and spy on the Soviet Union. Now, through its radar technology, the Soviet Union knew that the planes were flying over the Soviet Union. And indeed, the purpose of these flights, these secret flights, the CIA was counting just how many missile silos and mobile missile launchers and airfields and so forth that the Soviet Union had in its territory. It was gathering key military intelligence in the event of a war. This was a great point of frustration for the Soviet Union because they couldn't do anything about these high-altitude flights until they are able to launch a surface-to-air missile that is successful in shooting down one of the U-2 flights in 1960. As a result, the plane crashes over Soviet territory, and Francis Gary Powers, the American pilot of the flight, ejects from the plane, and then is taken into captivity. Now, initially, for CIA analysts in the United States, they know the plane has gone missing, has not returned. And so the official message of the United States government is that the U-2 was a weather plane and that it had gone missing and it had crashed. However, Nikita Khrushchev goes before the People's Congress in the Soviet Union and starts to produce evidence that they had captured the pilot and had taken debris from the plane. This is, of course, a huge embarrassment to the United States. It continued to maintain that it is a weather plane. And indeed, still today in Moscow, wreckage from the U-2 is still on display. Therefore, it is a very tense summit in Paris later that summer in 1960 when Nikita Khrushchev accuses the United States of lying about the plane and demands a public apology, which President Eisenhower refuses to deliver. In a great huff, Nikita Khrushchev storms out of the meeting, and it's a moment of crisis, and it looks like the Cold War could descend into a hot war. After Khrushchev storms out of the meeting, French President de Gaulle, who had worked with Eisenhower during World War II to liberate his native France, approached Eisenhower and reassured him that whatever happened, we are with you as a legacy of their alliance during World War II. Indeed, Nikita Khrushchev was famous for his rather histrionic and dramatic displays, famously at the United Nations, taking off his shoe and pounding it on the podium, declaring, "We will crush you," and bragging that the Soviet Union was churning out nuclear missiles like sausages. And indeed, Khrushchev tried to use those histrionics and emotionalism to intimidate the very young American president who came to the White House in 1961, John F. Kennedy. And indeed, when Khrushchev and Kennedy meet in Vienna in 1961, Kennedy is very much intimidated by the experience of Nikita Khrushchev. And Khrushchev feels that he can bully the young Kennedy and that Kennedy will not stand up to him. As proof of that belief, Khrushchev ordered the positioning of nuclear missiles on the communist island of Cuba, 90 miles off the United States coast. Cuba, of course, had experienced a revolution in the late 1950s in which Fidel Castro had driven out the Cuban president and proclaimed a communist dictatorship, and indeed very quickly contracts an alliance with the Soviet Union. And as part of that alliance, secretly, the Soviet Union starts shipping nuclear missiles and missile sites to the island of Cuba. This, of course, is a game changer in the course of the Cold War because now there are short-range and medium-range nuclear missiles located 90 miles away from Key West, Florida, that within a matter of moments could strike key U.S. cities. Within 2 minutes, Miami could be struck by a nuclear missile. And within about 20 minutes, Washington, D.C. itself could be struck by a nuclear missile. The United States originally is unaware of the location of these nuclear missiles on Cuba until additional U-2 flights fly over the island of Cuba, and then high surveillance photography reveals that Soviets and Cubans are gradually assembling missile sites across the island. This intelligence from the CIA reaches President Kennedy, and he assembles the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the military secretly to decide what to do. Many in the military, senior commanders, Army and Air Force and Navy, demand that the United States immediately invade the island of Cuba, that there is no time to be wasted, that any day these missiles could be assembled and start to strike U.S. targets and U.S. cities, and they demand that the president immediately launch an invasion of Cuba. And indeed, it seems that President Kennedy is willing to do that initially. He assembles an elite committee called XCOM of key government leaders, the State Department, War Department, military officials, the vice president, that come together and have numerous sessions each day deciding what to do about the missiles in Cuba. Finally, President Kennedy goes on TV and delivers a very famous televised address in which he issues a very dramatic statement in which he says, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." So this is a very hawkish, dramatic statement here by President Kennedy on October 22nd, 1962, in which he declares that if there's a missile launched from Cuba, we are not going to blame the Cubans and localize the conflict simply to the island of Cuba. We are going to view this as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States. We will respond with an attack on the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the moment of the Cold War in which things are most tense and most dramatic and come closest to a Third World War. And this Third World War would be a nuclear war and result in a nuclear holocaust with a horrific number of casualties, millions and millions of lives lost in Western Europe, the United States, and also the Soviet Union. The response of the Soviet Union to President Kennedy's declaration is to continue to build the missile silos and continue to supply them. And indeed, Premier Khrushchev announces that additional Soviet ships will sail across the Atlantic into the Caribbean to the island of Cuba to continue resourcing the development of the missiles there. President Kennedy rejects the calls of his own military leaders to invade Cuba, but instead establishes a quarantine or a blockade around the island of Cuba, in which the United States Navy will stop and inspect every ship headed towards Cuba to see if it is providing parts to supply the construction of missiles. If the ships do not stop, then the United States Navy will fire upon them. Khrushchev announces that he will continue to send the Soviet ships all the way to the island of Cuba, and if they are fired upon, the Soviet ships will respond in kind and eventually will descend into nuclear war. And therefore, these are very tense several days in October of 1962 as the Soviet ships attack the island of Cuba. The U.S. Navy is holding on to its blockade around Cuba, demanding the Soviet ships stop. Khrushchev says he will not stop the ships. The ships continue to move against Cuba, and the tension continues to build as the two sides come together in the Caribbean. Meanwhile, in the United Nations Security Council, Adlai Stevenson, former U.S. president, delivers photographic evidence from the U-2 flights of the missiles in Cuba, to the shock of the world, but to the continual denial of the Soviet Union. And indeed, Adlai Stevenson's stern demand that the Soviets acknowledge the construction of missiles is a key point. And indeed, the tensions are finally resolved when Nikita Khrushchev orders that the ships turn around and do not confront the United States Navy in the waters of the Caribbean, and agree to dismantle the missiles on the island of Cuba for a U.S. promise that they will not invade the island of Cuba. A secret portion of the agreement also is that the United States would dismantle some obsolete missiles that were located in Turkey, not far from the Soviet Union. So the key moment here, the very tense moment of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Cold War could have become a hot war, and indeed is diffused. As a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis, within the Politburo, within the Soviet leadership, Nikita Khrushchev is viewed as weak and catering to the West, and he is forcibly removed from power and therefore sent into retirement and loses his control as premier. Once again, after the removal of Khrushchev, we see the emergence of a third troika, collective leadership by three individuals in the Soviet Union, including Leonid Brezhnev, Alexei Kosygin, Nikolai Pogorsky. Eventually, it is Brezhnev that emerges as Soviet premier and again takes his title of General Secretary of the Communist Party, the most influential position over the Soviet Union. Brezhnev will preside over Soviet policy and foreign policy from 1964, after the fall of Khrushchev, all the way to his death in 1982. Brezhnev had also made a name for himself during the course of the Second World War, had become a Soviet hero, and therefore after entered into politics. And wanting to show a stronger face and indeed greater strength of the Soviet Union, even as the economy of the Soviet Union continues to weaken, Brezhnev issued what was called the Brezhnev Doctrine in 1968. The Brezhnev Doctrine declared that any Eastern European state, any socialist country that started to veer towards capitalism, would be subject to a Soviet invasion. Indeed, the Soviet Union had already crushed a democratic revolution in Hungary in 1956. And then in 1968, in an event known as the Prague Spring, as the people of Prague in Czechoslovakia rise up and demand their freedoms and conduct peaceful protests, Brezhnev sends in the Soviet army, squelching the protests and demanding their end and securing Czechoslovakia as part of that buffer state and under the control of the Eastern Bloc of the Soviet Union. Also in 1979, under Brezhnev's leadership, the Soviet Union launches one of its biggest military disasters. This will be an invasion of Afghanistan. There had been a Marxist government in the state of Afghanistan that had been toppled by Islamic leaders. Therefore, not wanting to see the decline of communist revolution around the world, Brezhnev orders Soviet troops to move into Afghanistan. The very, very forbidding terrain of that country, of course, is going to lead to huge losses. The British had tried to invade Afghanistan in the 19th century with great futility, and now the Soviets will spend 10 years in Afghanistan, resulting in horrific casualties across the country. And indeed, Afghanistan is very easy to take, but very difficult to hold. And so the Soviet army descending from the north took key cities, but very quickly Afghan fighters retreated to the mountains and to the numerous rocky terrain throughout Afghanistan. Indeed, the Soviets made no friends among the populace in Afghanistan because they would send in their helicopter gunships and just strafe villages, killing men, women, and children in all these Afghan towns and villages. Therefore, the brutality of the Soviet army in Afghanistan and the indiscriminate killing of villagers and tribal leaders and women and children leads to the mobilization of what becomes known as the Mujahideen, or holy warriors. These are Afghan Islamic guerrilla fighters that retreat to the mountains and would conduct ambushes and assassinations against Soviet troops and Soviet convoys. The Mujahideen are aided by a secret American CIA operation that was led by a Texas congressman named Charlie Wilson. Charlie Wilson worked with the CIA to increase the United States funding for what became known as Operation Cyclone. Operation Cyclone was providing shoulder rocket launchers to the Mujahideen in the mountains to shoot down these Soviet gunships. And Operation Cyclone, although a secret operation funded by the American CIA, is enormously successful. And indeed, Operation Cyclone and the provision of these shoulder rocket launchers are instrumental in turning the tide of battle for the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Therefore, with a failing economy and a disastrous military campaign into Afghanistan, we see by the early 1970s something of a cooling, something of a relaxing of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union over the course of the Cold War that becomes known as détente. Détente, French word for relaxation or relaxing of the tensions. And indeed, President Nixon is able to meet with Soviet Premier Brezhnev at Camp David in the hills of Maryland, and shortly after, signed the first arms limitation agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was the SALT I Treaty, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty I of 1972, in which the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to limit the production of the number of nuclear missiles and devices that they would produce. SALT I would also be followed by SALT II, 1979, which United States President Jimmy Carter and Leonid Brezhnev signed, although the treaty was never ratified by the United States Senate. Over the course, however, of the 1960s and particularly the 1970s, the Soviet economy is clearly failing. Whereas the Bolsheviks promised communism and a perfect, equitable society where all things would be shared and there would be no rich and poor, there would be no haves and have-nots, but rather through a communist system there would be infinite prosperity, that is certainly not a reality after all these years after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Indeed, there is horrific starvation throughout the country. The Soviet Union is still not able to feed itself, still importing grain from the United States. There's rampant alcoholism. The mortality rate is very high for Soviet citizens, and the average death rate for Soviet men and women is something like in their 40s and in their 50s, often succumbing to the effects of alcoholism. Infant mortality rate is very high. The number of abortions in the Soviet Union is very high. Many people are living in poverty. Many people don't have a job, or if they have a job, they don't get paid for 6 months. The only individuals that are really prospering and become the object of disdain for many Russian citizens are the so-called apparatchiks. The apparatchiks are government officials, bureaucrats. They work for the government, so they get paid by the government, but yet they do very little. And indeed, the government bureaucracy, indeed the entire economy and government itself of the Soviet Union is enormously inefficient and unproductive. And as a result, the economy in the Soviet Union continues to shrink and collapse and becomes very poor by the late 1970s and into the early 1980s. After the death of Leonid Brezhnev in 1982, we see a succession of very old apparatchik leaders of the Soviet Union. These are old men, old Bolsheviks who had been around the Communist Party for a long time. It was kind of the next man up to lead the Soviet Union, but they do not bring any ideas. They have no new concepts to reinvigorate the nation, and therefore the Soviet Union continues to rot as well as does its economy. Brezhnev is followed by Yuri Andropov, who you can see only lasts for less than 2 years as General Secretary of the Communist Party and leader of the Soviet Union. And then Andropov is followed by even shorter term by Konstantin Chernenko, General Secretary of the Communist Party, until he dies in 1985. So after a succession of old, detached bureaucrats who are committed to communist ideology but are not in touch with the sufferings of everyday people, finally the Soviet Union sees the ascension of a more capable and competent, invigorated leader in Mikhail Gorbachev, who becomes General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1985. Indeed, Gorbachev will be the last General Secretary of the Communist Party, and indeed, he will be the last leader of the Soviet Union as well. The Soviets by the mid-1980s were looking for a leader who is younger and could match the vigor of the very vigorous American president, Ronald Reagan. And so they settle on Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev was a key leader for ending the Soviet Union because his family too had experienced the horrors of the Stalinist regime. Indeed, Gorbachev had grown up in great poverty, and one of his grandfathers had received one of those knocks in the middle of the night, and the secret police had come and arrested his grandfather, executed him, and he was never seen again. And so Gorbachev grew up, even though he grew up as a politician in the Communist Party, the only party in the Soviet Union, he nevertheless is aware of some of the horrors and more extremes of the Stalinist regime. And therefore, gradually, Gorbachev works his way up through the ranks, and then in 1979 moves further into the party apparatus. In that year, privately, he told his wife, "We cannot keep going on like this," privately acknowledging the communist system was not working and something needed to be changed. And therefore, with this rotting economy and this bloated military budget, and with so much unhappiness throughout the Soviet Union, Gorbachev initiates a series of pivotal reforms that were designed to reform the communist system, reform the Soviet Union, but really resulted in its end. This includes glasnost, the Russian word for openness, that the Soviet Union could not continue as a state that squelched so much free speech and free press and the freedom of assembly. He called for openness and a acceptance by the government and the state police to criticize the Soviet system if you wanted to. Also, the policy of perestroika. Perestroika was restructuring the economy to be more like a capitalist or free market system to allow for private property and the creation of private businesses and a movement away from the hardcore communism of the past that was clearly failing. Gorbachev also advocated demokratizatsiya, which was the democratization of Russia, allowing people to have the right to vote and moving towards more self-government, and also uskoreniya, the acceleration of all these ideas, accelerating the economy to be able to compete with the West. Whereas Gorbachev comes into office with these ideas and starts to promote a more open system and open dialogue with the West, there's a very visible tragedy showing the failures of the Soviet system in 1986 with the Chernobyl nuclear accident. The Chernobyl nuclear plant was a nuclear power plant in the Ukraine. And in 1986, the main reactor begins to melt down. And because of the cumbersome bureaucracy and the failures of safeguards, the reactor melts down and emits vast amounts of radiation into the air. Initially, the Soviet government denies the accident and does not report it, but Western scientists identify high levels of radiation coming from the area. Finally, the Soviet government admits it. And then there are tens of thousands of individuals who lived in the neighboring areas, worked at the plant or in the local town of Pripyat that had been exposed to radiation and eventually will die from radiation sickness and various cancers. So the Chernobyl accident with the failure of the bureaucracy to really contain the accident really exposes the weaknesses and the failures of the system. Gorbachev comes to office with a new willingness to dialogue with the West. And indeed, after a meeting with United Kingdom Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, Thatcher announced in a press conference, "I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together." That was a rather stunning announcement because in the past, there hadn't been such an amiable relationship between U.S. and Western leaders and Soviet leaders. And indeed, the relationship between the Soviet Union and the West improves after Mikhail Gorbachev meets President Ronald Reagan in Geneva, Switzerland at the Geneva Summit in 1985. The two leaders had never met before, and indeed, after a series of parties and meetings and negotiations, eventually the idea is proposed that the two leaders would meet privately, get rid of their staffs, cut back on the cumbersome negotiation and too much talking and negotiating at the table, but rather just sit down and engage what often became known as fireside diplomacy of the two leaders, only aided with a translator, to sit down and negotiate a more peaceful world and also the reduction and elimination of nuclear weapons and the nuclear threat. The relationship starts off quite well between President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev and continues in 1986, the following year, in Reykjavik, Iceland. At Reykjavik, the two leaders met at the Hofi House in Reykjavik, and very quickly the two start to discuss what would it look like to have a world without nuclear weapons. Would it be possible for the United States and the Soviet Union to indeed agree to elimination of all weapons? And the talks are very hopeful. However, Mikhail Gorbachev, in the course of the Reykjavik summit, makes a demand that the United States end Ronald Reagan's advanced technological program that he had proposed called SDI, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, sometimes nicknamed the Star Wars program. The Star Wars program was not an actual technological program in the United States, but it was an idea by President Reagan to use a series of satellites and lasers in space that if a nuclear missile was launched, the lasers in space could detect them and shoot them in the middle of space before they could land on the Earth. Therefore, it becomes a defensive program, almost acting as a shield or a bubble over the United States, rendering Soviet missiles irrelevant. However, it was not actually a reality. It was much more of a threat because such technology did not really exist. Mikhail Gorbachev at the Reykjavik summit demanded that Reagan give up the Star Wars program and this defensive initiative, but Reagan refused. Therefore, a plan to scrap all nuclear missiles was shelved, and the Reykjavik summit was determined to be a failure. Until the following year, in 1987, when the two leaders met again, Gorbachev dropped his demand for the elimination of the Star Wars program, and the two sides signed a very key treaty that led to the reduction of nuclear missiles at the Washington Summit in 1987, and then followed up in 1988 with the Moscow Summit with President Reagan visiting Moscow. As a result of these treaties, for the first time, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed that there were too many nuclear missiles. They agreed to stop constructing them and to start actually reducing their stockpiles. The Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev was desperate for a deal because the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan turned out to be a complete disaster. As a result of Operation Cyclone, low morale among the Soviet troops, and the high organization and morale of the Mujahideen Islamic warriors in Afghanistan, they drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan in a huge humiliation to the Soviet army in 1989. Just 2 years later, Mikhail Gorbachev finalized the so-called START Treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, in 1999 with U.S. President George Bush. As a result of the economic failures of the Soviet Union, the collapsing economy, and the embarrassment of the Afghanistan campaign, we see the decline of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s with an attempted coup against Mikhail Gorbachev's leadership in 1991. In August of 1991, fearing the coming changes to the Soviet Union, realizing that Mikhail Gorbachev's policies, particularly of glasnost and perestroika, were restructuring the Soviet economy, moving towards capitalism, and leading to more open society, more open criticism of the Soviet totalitarian system. There's an old guard of Soviet leaders, Soviet generals particularly, who react and attempt to seize control of the government. They do this by placing Mikhail Gorbachev under house arrest as his dacha in the Crimea, placing him under house arrest and restricting his travel. They order Soviet troops and tanks into Red Square and into Moscow in a bid to control the government. However, it is clear that the coup really collapses very quickly, and that the people of Russia are much more with Gorbachev's reforms than they are with the old line, hardline Soviet military leadership. Indeed, thousands of people flood into the squares and into the streets, joining in protests. A key leader of the rebellion and refusal to join the coup is the mayor of Moscow, Boris Yeltsin, who famously gets on top of a Soviet tank and rallies the people, encourages them to stand against the hardline generals, which results in the failure of the coup. Indeed, the Soviet troops never fire upon the people as they would have in the old days, and the coup collapses. Numerous generals are arrested. Gorbachev is released, and then, very dramatically, that Christmas Day of 1991, General Secretary Gorbachev announces the end of the Soviet Union, that because of its economic and political failures and its inability to maintain its foreign policy, that there will be no more Soviet Union. Therefore, in some ways, this was the greatest Christmas present the world had seen in a long time with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And indeed, shortly after, Mikhail Gorbachev announces that he is resigning, and the first president of Russia now is that mayor of Moscow, Boris Yeltsin, who stood up against the coup leaders. Therefore, after 1991, we can no longer talk about the country of the USSR, the Soviet Union, but rather the Soviet Union is divided into constituent states that had formed it many years ago, often called Russia and the Commonwealth of Independent States. Thus, the Soviet Union, which used to include 15 other countries such as Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Moldova, and Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, all those states are given self-government, and they can determine their own politics and their own future, although there is a close relationship with the largest country still in the world of Russia to the north. Boris Yeltsin is a key figure in the history of modern Russia, but in many ways a puppet of events that are much larger than him and in many ways out of his control. There had been no pattern before of how you transition a country from communism, decades of communism, to free market economics and a capitalist system. And indeed, Russia really stumbles through the process, particularly through the 1990s. In the 1990s, there are whole areas of the economy, gold mines, copper mines, oil fields, fields of natural gas, large sections of the military, factories, weapons, guns, tanks, jeeps, military factories that were previously owned by the Soviet Union. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the question immediately becomes who owns all of this, because there is no Soviet Union anymore. Therefore, many of the constituent states, like Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, might claim them to be owned by their governments, but often before those countries can do that, local officials quickly sell off for their own profit, but at an extremely low price, entire copper mines or entire mines of nickel or lead or oil fields or natural gas. And as a result, it is really a bumbling, stumbling effort to move Russia from a communist system to free market economics, sometimes called economic shock therapy. It's almost like this jolting whiplash effect moving from communism to capitalism with privatization, selling things that used to be owned by the government to private individuals. Those private individuals who have a little bit of money may buy an entire mine or entire field of natural resources and instantly become incredibly rich. Therefore, the 1990s becomes a very violent place in Russia. There's a much stronger Russian mafia that emerges, particularly in the cities of Russia. There's a whole new generation of oligarchs, very rich individuals, almost like the boyars of the past, under the that are manipulating a very weak czar. These new rich millionaires and billionaires bought former segments of the economy, of the Soviet economy, for just pennies on the dollar, and now are fabulously wealthy. These oligarchs are really controlling what is going on with the government, and particularly the president. Boris Yeltsin, although he may have meant well, in many ways was a weak figure for the time. He's known as a very jolly and playful figure, often manipulated by the rich around him. He often did nothing in public to provoke an image of strength and resolute leadership. And he is also an alcoholic, very much given to alcoholism and his love for vodka. And therefore, you have a very weak ruler, even as these merchants are, and millionaires and billionaires are dividing up the country. And indeed, much of the Soviet military, particularly AK-47s and other weapons, make their way to Africa. And it's going to be decimating for Africa as numerous civil wars and insurgent groups in the jungles of Africa kill each other through the use of former Soviet military apparatus. But throughout the 1990s, sometimes this capitalism in Russia, the former Soviet Union, is called gangster capitalism because there's so much theft, there's so much corruption and bribery and flattery and illegal activities with the government. Indeed, since the 1990s, Russia is consistently rated on some of the corruption indices as one of the most corrupt countries in the world because of these illegal dealings. But because of his weakness and because of his inability to control the economic events occurring around him, and particularly because of his problem with alcohol, Boris Yeltsin suddenly decides to resign as president of Russia on the last day of 1999, December 31st, 1999, and in accordance with the new Russian constitution, names his prime minister as his successor and as the acting president of Russia. And this is Vladimir Putin. Therefore, Putin, who is named president in 2000 and certainly shortly announces his candidacy for election, is indeed elected president, will serve as president of Russia from 2000 to 2008. And then after a 4-year break, as we shall see, it was not really a break, is reelected president again in 2008 and remains in office still today. Vladimir Putin is, of course, a key figure on the international stage today. We cannot understand the Russian Federation of today and Vladimir Putin apart from Putin's story. Putin, in many ways, World War II, the Great Patriotic War, is not a far-off event. It is very near and dear to him. Indeed, his parents suffered tremendously in the middle of World War II. Putin was born in Leningrad. He is the youngest of 3 children. Both of his older siblings were killed very shortly in connection to World War II. His father had been his soldier. His grandfather, in fact, had been a cook to Vladimir Lenin during the Russian Revolution. And Putin's father had been a soldier in the Red Army and had helped in the defense of the city of Leningrad, where his son Vladimir was born. His father was horrifically injured in World War II in defending a key bridge, an access point to Leningrad, and indeed was confined to crutches and had to crutch his way all the way across the city to get back home. When, upon arriving home, he sees that his wife, who was made very frail by the famine in the course of World War II, the city officials are just about to remove her body and throw it into a mass grave, believing that she is dead from the famine. But his father intervenes and prevents this because his wife is still alive. Vladimir Putin also has a younger brother who died in infancy and is buried in a mass grave outside of the city of Leningrad. So the tragedy and the suffering of World War II is still very much part of Putin's story and very much closer to him than it is to a lot of other Western observers. In any case, Vladimir Putin goes to university and graduates with a law degree from the University of Leningrad, continues his life as a scholar, and eventually joins the KGB. He's an important operative, particularly in East Germany during the course of the Cold War, serving as a KGB officer. Eventually, he moves to Moscow, and he is named in charge of the organization that is the successor to the KGB. This is the Federal Security Service, in which Putin is in charge of. So thus, the state secret police of the Russian Federation today, known as the Federal Security Service, is once again one of those other secret police organizations that we've seen go all the way back to Ivan the Terrible with the Oprichniki, the Tsar's Okhrana, the Cheka of the early Bolsheviks, the KGB of the Cold War era, and now the Federal Security Service. With the declining influence of Boris Yeltsin, it is Boris Yeltsin who promotes Vladimir Putin from being the director of the Federal Security Service to being his prime minister. And thus, when Yeltsin announces his retirement on the last day of 1999, he makes and appoints Vladimir Putin as president of Russia. Putin will go on to be elected numerous times. Indeed, there were many ministers that Yeltsin could have promoted, and it didn't seem like Putin was going to be that extraordinary. Putin really makes a name for himself immediately in his first term as president during the Second Chechen War. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the emergence of the Commonwealth of Independent States, there are many areas and regions of Russia that seek to take the opportunity to separate themselves, declare their independence, and create their own nation. One of those areas was in the northern Caucasus Mountains, in the southern part of Russia, of Chechnya. And in Chechnya, Islamic fundamentalist militants declared their own independent Islamic republic. And indeed, Russian troops had gone into Chechnya before to squelch these rebellions at the cost of enormous loss of life. But it is Vladimir Putin that really rallies the troops and prosecutes this war with a vengeance and a determination that Boris Yeltsin had not done in the first Chechen War in the 1990s, thus securing the control over the area by the Russian Federation. Putin will go on to be elected to his own term as president of Russia in 2002, serving a 6-year term. Then, according to the terms of the Russian Constitution of the 1990s, a Russian president is limited to 2 terms. Thus, by 2008, Putin had already served the most of 2 terms and therefore had to give up the presidency. What he does is, to hold on to power, is concoct a secret deal with the Prime Minister of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, and as a result, Medvedev would become president and Putin would become his Prime Minister. But of course, it was obvious to all independent observers that Medvedev was not really the strong president of Russia. It is clear he's really the puppet of Vladimir Putin. So Putin became Prime Minister only for 4 years while Medvedev was president, and then heavily influenced Medvedev behind the scenes, and then eventually ran for president again in 2012, winning a 6-year term, then being reelected in 2018, being elected to a second term, which will last until 2024. Therefore, Vladimir Putin is one of the most popular leaders in modern Russian history, but also one of the most powerful, and according to Western critics, one of the most corrupt and authoritarian as well. And indeed, Vladimir Putin has talked about his belief in what he calls sovereign democracy. By sovereign democracy, he believes in giving people the right to vote. But once they vote, the elected leader has enormous powers. And indeed, Vladimir Putin has overseen the revision of the Russian constitution several times that will enable him to stay in power even longer and accentuate his powers. Really, what keeps Vladimir Putin in office, his popularity numbers relatively high in Russia, is the strong Russian economy, which finally bounces back after the gangster capitalism of the 1990s. And indeed, we can see, since taking power in 2000, that the Russian economy really has boomed in terms of gross domestic product during the influence of Vladimir Putin as president or as prime minister. Much of the strength of the Russian economy is really due to the energy sector of natural gas and crude oil, which is abundant and being drilled in record numbers, particularly in Siberia to the east. And therefore, with very high oil prices for much of the 2000s, this has resulted in enormous revenues for the government and strengthening of the Russian economy. It has led to a level of prosperity that Russian citizens have not seen throughout their lives. And indeed, more billionaires live in the city of Moscow than anywhere else in Europe. And we've seen enormous reconstruction projects, construction of new hospitals and schools and universities throughout Russia. And much of the prosperity of the Russian economy is really due to the large amounts of oil and natural gas that Russia has been shipping to Europe, and now Europe is incredibly heavily dependent upon. Therefore, it was in 2014 that Russia celebrated its coming into the modern age with the Sochi Olympics. For a long time, the Russian Federation had campaigned to secure one of the Olympic Games, and finally the Olympic Committee granted the Winter Games to the southern city, Russian city of Sochi in 2014. And indeed, there are enormous celebrations. There was also incredible graft and bribery and corruption in the bidding projects for the construction of stadiums and venues for the Olympic Games. But nevertheless, Vladimir Putin really came into his own during these games, and Russia became the center of world attention. Although Putin's popularity numbers remain high in Russia, there is a strong anti-Putin movement that criticizes the corruption in the government, also the clamping down on free speech and free media. The government really controls state television and many of the newspapers in Russia. There are limitations on internet access. And so from time to time, there are protests against Putin and his power grab. And very disconcerting for a lot of Russians and Western observers is that frequently primary critics of Vladimir Putin and the oligarchs that support him has led to mysterious deaths, even assassinations, either outright shootings in the streets of major Russian cities or very suspicious deaths of completely healthy people. A good example of that was Alexander Litvinenko, who was a strong critic of Putin and also a candidate for the opposition party. And suddenly, he is discovered to be sick with radiation poisoning. And it leads to his hospital confinement and indeed his death in 2006 from being contaminated by a radioactive isotope. Many Western observers believe that there's no private individual that would have access to such nuclear materials except an operative working for the Russian government and perhaps on the private orders of President Putin himself. Indeed, after the Sochi Olympics, Putin takes advantage of the popularity and the end of the games by moving into the Crimea, which was part of the country of Ukraine, and seizing it as a Russian possession. And as there are also large Russian-speaking groups in eastern Ukraine, the Russian army also moves into eastern Ukraine as well. So therefore, the country of Ukraine that had been gradually moving towards the West and closer alliance with the West and closer alliance with NATO and away from Russia is really divided up, and part of it is conquered by the Russian army and remains under Russian occupation today. The response of the Western world is very weak, with the simple imposing of some sanctions that have had very marginal effect on the Russian economy or on Putin's popularity at home. Indeed, in 2016, many accusations occur of Russian influence on the American election in 2016. And indeed, it is become clear that there are numerous non-state actors, those that were probably working for the Russian government, that endeavored to promote advertisements supporting the candidacy of Donald Trump, but no collusion had actually been proven between the Trump campaign and the Russian government as well. Therefore, we can conclude our study of Russia with some thoughts on contemporary Russia today. Russia is an enormously proud country. It has an incredible history with scientists and artists and poets and the ballet and the arts and novelists and composers, fabulous leaders who bring Russia into the century in which it is living after falling behind. But it's also, of course, a country of enormous suffering and violence. Indeed, the Russian people themselves say that their great curse is their enormous capacity to suffer. And we've seen that in famines and revolutions and civil wars as well. But in many ways, Russia today is an enormously prosperous country. It has come into the modern world and is a key player on the international stage in some ways like never before. It is unclear exactly what the future holds for Russia. Will it continue to veer towards rather totalitarian governments? Indeed, the strong leadership of Vladimir Putin is still very much in demand and very popular within Russia itself today. Or will it collapse into these seasons, as is so common in Russian history, in which oligarchs, the wealthy, perhaps nobles, the boyars of the past, really control the country, and the central government is actually quite weak. The future is uncertain, but what is clear is that Russia's very large country and very critical country will continue to remain a major player on the world stage and continue to make major contributions to the development of civilization.